Okay, so we're at 5 past the hour now, so I think it would be good to get started. We may have some others trickling in. We've got a nice group here already, so great to see all of you here online. I come to you virtually from EGAP's home at IGS. Actually, I'm in New York, but we wanted to organize these events because we realized that, well, typically, I think we would do a presentation of this project as a plenary session at one of the EGAP meetings, but even so, that wouldn't necessarily allow for everybody in the network to gain access to the findings. You know, the Metadata projects are a major undertaking, and it's something that, you know, EGAP has become known for. So insofar as your EGAP members and carrying the EGAP flag, we thought it'd be good for you to get a, you know, sort of in-depth look at the results of the metadata's. So in case you weren't aware, we just concluded a round of 3 metadata research programs. The one we're going to be hearing about today is the metadata focused on community-based policing, and Graham was the head of the steering committee on that, and he's going to be presenting the meta level results. We also have 2 others for which we have dissemination events coming up in the coming weeks, one on taxation and then another on natural resource governance. So you should have received invitations to sign up for those. And I think that it's very interesting. So these are 3 that have recently been concluded. You know, the projects had been ongoing for about 4 years from conception to completion, funded by DFID. You probably know that there was a metadata round that had been completed about 1.5 years ago. The information and accountability metadata, and then just so you're aware, there's also a 5th metadata round that's currently kind of in the pre-fieldwork stage on women's political participation. And so obviously that's been sort of slowed down by the COVID crisis. Fieldwork hasn't been able to commence. It's actually given the teams some time to think a little bit through the design. And then also now we have the opportunity for them to learn from these 3 new metadata rounds that have been completed. So we're because of the online format, we're going to be a bit more traditional in the way that we do things. We'll let Graham present he's got about a half hour worth of material that he's going to get through, and then we'll do the Q&A afterward. I found that on the Zoom format, the sort of like constant interruption approach is too hard to manage. It's difficult for the speaker to kind of keep track of what's going on with different people to see who's got questions and stuff like that. So we'll be a bit more traditional today. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Graham. The stage is yours, Graham.
Great. Thank you so much for waking up early. Some of you, including Cyrus, coming from Berkeley and others. I really appreciate the chance to share some of these results and look forward to talking about them. This is only the 2nd time that we presented the results, so really look forward to your feedback about this project that I've been working on with Fotini Christia and Jeremy Weinstein and 22 others. As well as the involvement of many other people at EGAP through its kind of long life cycle, starting with McCartan and then Susan Hyde in their roles as executive directors before Cyrus, and Jay Lyle, who helped us develop the project at the beginning. And I'll introduce each of the other scholars as I talk about the particular projects. So this project is about the police. So if a state is defined as the quasi-monopoly on the legitimate use of force, then the police are really at its heart. They exercise the state's legitimate force themselves, and they work to maintain the state's quasi-monopoly on it. So how do we know if the police are fulfilling this purpose and are maintaining the legitimacy of the state? We can look to see if non-state actors are using force, such as criminals, self-defense groups, and vigilantes. This would indicate a breakdown in the monopoly of the use of force. And second, are the police and the force that they exercise legitimate? We see when we look around the world that there are limits to the monopoly on the use of force in a number of states. Although violence from war has decreased steadily since the end of World War II, in many regions of the world, crime and homicide are really on the rise. And today, 1 in 4 people are living in contexts of violence and insecurity, about 1.5 billion people. When we look at that second dimension, we also see limits to the legitimacy of the police and the state's use of force. We can operationalize the legitimacy of the police in a number of different ways, but one that many scholars draw on is measuring citizen trust in the police through surveys. This varies really quite widely around the world. So in developed countries, there's very high trust. And indeed, in many European countries, citizens seem to trust the police more than they trust even their neighbors. Of course, this obscures huge trust gaps between majority and minority groups in most places around the world. In the US, Black Americans, for example, hold substantially lower trust in the police than do white Americans. And then when we look in the Global South, trust in the police is much lower for everyone. Less than half in Latin America trust the police, which is the region where we'll do 2 of the experiments as part of this project. So as a result, reducing crime and insecurity now stands at the top of the global security agenda. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted in 2015, commit countries to achieve just, peaceful, and inclusive societies with a focus on insecurity due to crime and violence. And at the same time, with widespread Black Lives Matter protests against police abuse in the United States and around the world, the issue of how to address inequalities in the criminal justice system and rein in police abuse have never been more salient. But policymakers face a problem, which is that most of the policies that we have developed over the last decades to reduce crime have often undermined citizen trust and the legitimacy of the police. Examples of this trade-off between reducing crime on the one hand and maintaining trust on the other can be seen kind of around the world, documented in the media and in recent social science scholarship. Stop and frisk policies in New York City, pacification campaigns in Rio and Brazil, and broken windows policing efforts around the world, all of which aimed to reduce crime, but had the side effect of undermining citizen trust and cooperation with the police. Trust matters not only because it undermines the legitimacy of the state and its police force, but because it interrupts what's designed to be a virtuous cycle of citizen cooperation with the police. Considerable research documents that police effort to reduce crime really depends on the cooperation of citizens who provide tips about future crimes, identify problems in the community that may lead to crime, and also provide evidence about past crimes to enable prosecution. And when citizens don't trust the police, research shows that citizens are unwilling to cooperate with the police and provide that information, and instead may be silent. And so without their trust, then there's no cooperation, and it's hard for the police to be effective at reducing crime. So as a result, we ask in this research whether we can reduce crime while building positive citizen-police relations. And we do so by examining community policing, which is one of the most celebrated police reforms in recent decades. And it's a policy that's designed precisely to address this double-edged sword of reducing crime and maintaining citizen trust. So community policing is implemented in a wide variety of ways, but it is in general a strategy for encouraging the public, citizens, to act as partners with the police in preventing crime and promoting security based on the specific needs of their community. We saw another definition of it in Tuesday night's debate. Sorry, it says last night. Tuesday night's debate, which as Joe Biden called it, the idea that we have to have community policing like we had before, where officers get to know the people in the communities. That's when crime went down. So it's bringing citizens into the policing process to improve the quality of policing. In particular, this tends to mean four things. The first is the implementation of frequent local beat patrols. So officers are assigned particular geographic areas to regularly patrol, either on foot or in vehicles. Second, decentralized decision-making, where those local beat officers and their supervisors are provided with the authority to decide on how to allocate police resources within that area, drawing on the information that they gain through beat patrols. Third, community engagement, which is meant to broaden out the set of information that's transmitted from police to citizens, and especially from citizens to the police. This often takes the form of town hall meetings. And fourth, problem-oriented policing, which is a set of strategies for acting on the information that comes out of beat patrols and community engagement activities, and to try to problem solve underlying issues in the community that may lead to crime. And so in our paper, we advance an information-centered theory of police-citizen relations that tries to understand why these interventions might impact police effectiveness and also citizen trust. So local beat patrols, town hall meetings, and community watches are meant to increase the amount of information that is shared from citizens to the police in the form of tips and evidence about past crimes. This then enables the police to take both police and non-police responses through problem-oriented policing, where they're trying to problem solve areas of concern in the community, and also this decentralized decision-making where local beat cops can make decisions about where they're going to patrol on the basis of this information to try to reduce crime. And ideally, these then lead to a reduction in crime and a reduction in citizen perceptions of insecurity. What I want to highlight, though, is the key role of citizen trust in police in this schema. So these interventions, beat patrols, and town hall meetings are meant to bring the police in further contact with citizens and increase citizen trust in the police. But citizen trust is also affected by whether the police take those responses to crime and are effective users of the information that citizens provide. On the basis of this theory of change, community policing has been advocated for all over the world. It's in wide use in all continents and many countries, including to some degree in all but one of our study countries, Liberia. In the US, where we have kind of good data on this, about 30% of police agencies have adopted some form of community policing, and 90% of the largest have adopted it. An important advocacy organization, the International Council on Chiefs of Police, says that it should be a, quote, key operational philosophy of all police agencies. It's been implemented in the police forces that were constructed in Iraq and Afghanistan after the wars as a key operational strategy. And it's also an essential part of UN peacekeeping, training of new police forces in post-conflict settings, and a proposed response, including in the debate on Tuesday, to Black Lives Matter protest demands for action on police abuse in the US. So what do we know? We conducted a systematic review of the literature on the community policing and its components. What we found was major gaps in knowledge. There is a considerable number of RCTs around the increase of community presence of the police through frequent police patrols, as well as on problem-oriented policing. Both of these seem to reduce crime. But there's limited and actually somewhat mixed evidence on whether these interventions and others affect trust. Most of these studies are focusing particularly on measuring crime. In addition, there's almost no evidence from the Global South. Almost all of these experiments were conducted in the US, the UK, and Australia. And so there really isn't very much evidence on whether this is an effective tool in the many places where it's being adopted around the world, besides those 3 countries. And finally, very few of these studies examine all the components of community policing that are typically implemented together. And so if there are interactions between these different components, which is implied by our information-centered theory of community policing and by the kind of more informal theories of change of the police, then we won't be capturing the true effect of this intervention. So to preview where I'm going to go, I want to convince you that we implemented what a practitioner or scholar of community policing would call a reasonable model of this intervention as it's implemented in practice. And I'll show you that what we find in general is that it doesn't live up to its promise. So we find limited evidence in 3 cases of effects on citizen attitudes towards the police, but no effect in other settings. And so I'll present those experimental effects and some kind of informal ethnography of how this intervention was implemented to provide evidence on some mechanisms for why this didn't work. And we'll argue that a set of structural constraints seems to have held back its effectiveness. Okay, so what did we actually do? We ran 6 experiments in 6 contexts in the Global South. We ran cluster randomized experiments at the level of police beats, villages, districts, or neighborhoods. And we implemented in the treated areas a community policing intervention that I'll describe in a moment, and then ran baseline and endline surveys that were standardized across these 6 contexts so that we could learn about the effects of community policing on a common scale. And we also collected admin data from the police on citizen cooperation and on crime. So I'll describe in brief each of these experiments from kind of across the world. So the first was in Santa Catarina state in Brazil. So in Santa Catarina, we expanded an existing community policing program called Rede de Vizinhos to new places. Santa Catarina state is an industrial state that's quite relatively wealthy. It's a vacation destination, and it has crime that's relatively low within Brazil, but in absolute terms is very high in the world. And it's also a place that has the presence of organized crime, which leads to a sense of insecurity and some kind of major attacks. So Timo Fetzer, Rob Muga, Barbara Silva, and Pedro Souza worked with the Santa Catarina military police to implement an experiment to test out this version of community policing in 196 neighborhoods over the course of 7 months. The second context that we worked was the city of Medellin in Colombia. Aspects of community policing have been implemented in Medellin and in other places in Colombia in the past, but not regular community meetings. So this is a place that was known as the most violent city in the world in the 80s and had a really fearsome police reputation for kind of extrajudicial violence. Since then, there's been a marked improvement in crime and in police practices, but very little increase in citizen trust and assessment of how violent a place it is. So Eric Arias, Rebecca Hansen, Dorothy Kronik, and Taras Lau worked with the Medellin Metropolitan Police to test out whether community policing could improve the situation, and they conducted their experiment across the city at the beat level in 347 beats over the course of about 12 months. The third context was in Liberia's capital city, Monrovia. Ben Morris and Lily Sai worked with the Liberian National Police, which is a police force that was reconstituted after the end of the Civil War in 2003. And this is the first time that community policing is being tried in Liberia. This is a context that has really high crime and also vigilantism, which was something that in their own study, they measured effects on vigilante activity and are reporting that in their own paper. It's also a context with really limited history of state reach. So citizens don't have a lot of experience interacting with the state and its police force, and so don't know how to report on police abuse, for example. So they worked to develop an experiment in 100 neighborhoods in Monrovia over the course of about 11 months. Ali Chima, Ali Hassanein, and Jacob Shapiro implemented an experiment outside of Lahore in the Sheikhupura region in Punjab province in Pakistan. This is a context that has quite a bit lower crime than the other places that we worked, but police are among the least trusted institutions in Pakistan. And there are a couple of reasons for this. People believe that political connections are needed to get police to respond, and the police are also constrained by law in the kinds of crimes that they can investigate to really quite minor offenses, and so aren't able to investigate major crimes. And so they worked to develop a community policing intervention and also another version of the community policing intervention that focused on gender-based crime and engaged primarily women. And they report on that separately in their own paper. They worked with the Punjab police to implement this experiment in 100 beats over the course of about 6 months. We then worked in the Philippines, in Sorsogon province. So the Philippines National Police are associated by citizens, rightly, with President Duterte's drug war that takes place in other provinces in the Philippines and not in Sorsogon province. Nevertheless, citizens associated with that and thus really undermined trust in the police. In Sorsogon province, there is a low-level insurgency that's going on in other parts of the province, and we only worked in areas that were free of kind of insurgent activity. So Dotan Haim, Matthew Nanes, and Nico Ravanilla worked with the Philippines National Police. They implemented a large experiment in about 300 barangays, which in urban areas are neighborhoods and in rural areas are villages, over the course of about 17 months. Finally, we worked in Uganda. Rob Blair, Guy Grossman, and Anna Vilka developed a community policing intervention that picks up on some ideas about community policing that had been tried in an urban community near Kampala about 15 years ago that was determined to be a failure, in part because it was operating in a dense urban setting. And so this project was started from conversations with the Office of the Prime Minister and the police with the idea that that model might have been effective had it been implemented in rural areas of the country. And so that's what we did. They implemented this kind of nationwide in rural police stations. The police serve a dual role in Uganda. They try to prevent crime, but they also, in this autocratic setting, are a tool of the state to maintain the power of Museveni's NRM. Trust in the police is relatively low in Uganda, although it's kind of middle of the pack in sub-Saharan Africa. They implemented this study with the Ugandan police force in 72 police stations across the country over about 13 months. Okay, so I want to emphasize the diversity of these 6 contexts. Half were democracies, half autocracies. There's wide variation in how corrupt they are, from a high in Uganda to a low in Brazil. And they range from some of the poorest places in the world in Liberia to upper middle income countries in Colombia and Brazil. So if community policing works or it doesn't in these places, it'll be instructive about whether it's going to work in other parts of the Global South. So these projects were developed through detailed discussions with the police about what they thought would be effective. These were really quite self-selected partners who were interested in learning about the effectiveness of community policing on crime and trust in the police. And they were partnerships that revolved not just around implementation, but intervention design and outcome data collection. So what they developed together was a set of locally appropriate increases in community policing practices. And so that's what we test. And in particular, there were 4 dimensions that we changed in many of these contexts. In all of the settings, we implemented some form of community engagement. These were, in almost all cases, town hall meetings between citizens and local police commanders. So in these meetings, citizens shared concerns and highlighted community problems that lead to crime, and local police commanders attended and provided information about criminal justice procedures and how to report on police abuse and crime. We increased the frequency of foot patrols in about half the settings, and in those settings, the beat cops were the ones who were attending the town hall meetings. Third, we created or widely marketed hotlines for anonymously reporting crime and police abuse. And fourth, we developed community watch forums. These were forums for existing community watch groups. These are informal groups that we have in the US and around the world that aim to complement efforts by formal security services. They're especially common in places like Liberia, where vigilante justice is prevalent. And these were meant to be mechanisms to formalize these groups and engage them to cooperate with the police rather than to act independently. So in all the 6 cases, some form of town hall citizen police meetings were held. In half of them, the foot patrol frequency was increased. In half, citizen feedback mechanisms were introduced or promoted. In half, these forums were created to formalize citizen community watch groups. And these interventions lasted between 6 and 17 months. So our experimental design was to randomize the areas that would be assigned to these locally appropriate increases in community policing practices. So we randomly assigned neighborhoods and villages, in some cases police beats, in these 6 countries. And then we developed harmonized surveys that we deployed to citizens and officers, and also collected administrative data at baseline and endline from the police about crime rates and rates of citizen cooperation with the police. So to illustrate what we did, to take the Pakistan study, this is a map of the police beats in the Sheikhupura region outside of Lahore. These police beats were our study units. So we first randomly sampled in red a set of places where we were going to operate the study, and then we randomly assigned those either to control in white or to community policing intervention in purple, and then conducted baseline measures, randomized, and then conducted outcome measurement. So to illustrate that process, in March 2018, we conducted our baseline survey in Pakistan, about 3,500 people. We then randomized these beats into treated or control areas. The intervention ran for about 6 months. In Pakistan, this was compressed a little bit because of the timing of the study. And then we conducted an endline survey last fall. In these surveys in all 6 countries, we measured 4 primary sets of outcomes. The first was around security. So we conducted a gold standard victimization survey of citizens about crime victimization and their experiences with victimization by the police, as well as measures of perceived insecurity. Second, we measured perceptions of the police through citizen surveys, perceptions of police capacity, responsiveness, and intentions. Then we conducted an officer survey on perceptions of citizens and also police perceived norms of behavior among the police. And finally, we measured citizen cooperation in terms of tips and reports of police abuse. All in all, we conducted about 17,000 citizen interviews, 650 interviews of officers, and we collected crime data on 600 neighborhoods, villages, and police beats. So then in this study, we conducted a meta-analysis across these 6 settings where we're interested in identifying the average effect of community policing on these outcomes. We use a standard random effects estimator, which weights by the precision of the effect estimate. So really precise estimates get a higher weight than really imprecise estimates. And it's also weighted by a cross-study variation. So to illustrate how we did this, we measure the effect of community policing on crime tips, for example, in Colombia. So we have an estimate of the average treatment effect within Colombia. Then we have 5 other estimates from Brazil, Liberia, Pakistan, Philippines, and Uganda. One thing I want to highlight here is that in the Brazil study, we had a slightly different experimental design, which is an encouragement design. So we encouraged people to join community policing groups using a Facebook ad campaign and a community meeting. And that first stage was not effective at generating interest in the program. And so we have really imprecise estimates of the treatment effects for Brazil. This isn't a problem for our meta-analysis because these estimates are so imprecise, it means they basically drop out of all of our estimates. So the random effects estimate then is the random effects mean of those effects. And that's what I'll present to you in just a minute. So our overall findings, again, are that there's no impact of community policing on our key outcomes of security, trust in the police, or citizen cooperation with the police. We see only some limited positive results on some forms of citizen attitudes towards the police, and we only see those in some contexts. So I'll show you all the top line effects here. So to orient you to the plot, on the x-axis here, we have the impact of community policing, that estimated average treatment effect, along with a 95% confidence interval. So first, I'm going to show you the effect on crime victimization up here in the top. So if community policing works, it should reduce crime victimization. We should see an effect below 0, and the confidence interval should not cross 0. So that's not what we see. We see a precise null effect. We can rule out large impacts of large improvements on crime victimization. And we can also rule out large backlashes, which would be kind of positive effects. The second that I want to show you is our core measurement of trust, which is overall perceptions of the police. Here, trust should go up if community policing is working. Again, that's not what we see. There aren't improvements in citizen trust that we can detect, and there also isn't a backlash. When we look at all the effects together, we see that there are no significant effects in our top line outcomes. So overall, across our 6 contexts, community policing does not seem to lead to the changes that are expected by its proponents. We do find these limited mixed findings on attitudes. So as I just showed you, there's no change in our kind of core measure of trust, overall perceptions of the police. But we do see improvements in perceived police intentions in Liberia and Pakistan, and we see small improvements in perceived police capacity in Colombia. One of the reasons to run this metacata was to find out whether this intervention was differently effective across different kinds of places. What we see is very little heterogeneity across sites. It's not the case that this is effective in some places and not in others. We also looked at a large range of different kinds of heterogeneity by prior crime rates, by prior levels of trust in the police, communal trust, state legitimacy, and we see essentially no evidence of heterogeneity of effects in any of these dimensions, and we fail to reject the null of equal variances across the treated and controlled groups in each of the 6 settings, indicating that there isn't heterogeneity in some other dimension that we haven't yet explored. Happy to talk a little bit more about inferential threats during Q&A, but three that we might be worried about. One is crime displacement. In any intervention where you're trying to change crime, you might be pushing down crime in treated areas, but just pushing it into control areas. And so there we would expect to see decreases in crime over time from baseline to end line in treated areas, and increases in crime from baseline to end line in control areas. We fail to reject the null that is not happening. In terms of compliance, we see statistically significant increases in the couple of ways that we're able to measure compliance. We're not able to measure compliance in all the dimensions of the intervention, but we measure the knowledge of community meetings, the perceived frequency of foot patrols and vehicle patrols, and we see increases in those that are statistically significant, but not especially large. And so I think one of the ways to interpret these findings is that there wasn't, from citizens' perspective, there wasn't a huge increase in interactions with the police. And I'll come back to that in just a second. The third that you might be wondering about is the kind of short duration of the interventions. We looked back across our systematic review of all of the experiments that have been done in the past in the US, the UK, and Australia. What we find is that the duration of our experiments is really quite comparable and is in the middle of the pack of those past experiments that do find some positive effects in terms of reducing crime in those other settings. So then why did community policing fall short in these 6 settings? We conducted kind of informal ethnography of the experience of this intervention, and also collected data on some aspects of how it was implemented beyond our experimental measures of compliance. So the following are a set of our speculations about why this didn't work. The first item that we identified was that there was, in some settings, there was a lack of prioritization by leadership, either at the station level or at a central level, which meant that other important police activities were prioritized over community policing. Second, we saw that there was surprisingly high rotation of line officers, and also in some cases station leadership, even within the course of our experiment. This may have undermined the ability of officers to get to know the communities and to become familiar to citizens. And third, we saw across most of the settings a quite limited capacity of the police to address community concerns. So even when they were able to identify those concerns, they didn't have the resources or the time to respond to them. So in terms of that officer rotation, we saw that officers are regularly rotated between stations, kind of surprisingly quickly. In Pakistan and Philippines, between 1 and 3, officers are rotated between 1 and 3 months. Secondly, in terms of the capacity and resource constraints, we measured the officers per capita and budget, kind of total budget per officer. And so we can see is that some of our contexts are serving huge populations with few officers and few resources. So in Liberia, for example, there's a $3,000 budget per officer, which is 5% of the budget in Brazil, and they're serving about 1,000 people compared to the 300 in Colombia. So identify three policy implications of this work. The first is that structural reforms may be needed before incremental policy changes to police practices like community policing, but also other things like body-worn cameras, may be needed to yield changes to these important outcomes that we care about, like security or citizen trust. So these might look like changes to the incentives of officers and police leadership to tie them to building citizen trust, or creating mechanisms for citizens to hold police to account, not just to share their concerns. The second implication is that efforts to improve citizen-police relations that were shown to be effective in global north contexts may fall short in police agencies without the resources to respond to community concerns. It's great to engage with citizens and identify these concerns, and that may have had some kind of marginal effects that we weren't able to detect, but it doesn't seem to matter unless you're without the ability to respond to those concerns. And third, I've drawn this kind of stark distinction between the global north and the global south, but I think when we look at when we think about the places in the US where improvements in trust and a reduction in police abuse are demanded and most needed, they're not altogether that different from the context that many of the contexts that we study. And so I think there's some skepticism warranted about past evidence that has some limitations, which include that the existing studies are not testing community policing as the bundle of practices as they're implemented in practice, as we and only a small number of other studies have been able to do. So I'll leave it there. I'm really looking forward to your comments. This is a joint project of 22 people and many, many more research assistants. And we're really happy to kind of be sharing this with you at this point. So thanks so much for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Graham. So I can keep an eye on the participants list. I think the most straightforward way to do this would be if people can use the show raise hand function on the participants list. I think that should be active. And then I can call on people. Actually, I'm looking on my participants list and I'm not seeing the raised hand. Is that is it there? It is there. No, I'm not seeing it. Is the raised hand active for other people on? Oh yeah, it is there. Perfect, fantastic. All right, and so then I'll just try to take people as they pop up. Okay, so we've got a question from Amanda. Amanda, go ahead.
Hi, Graham. Thanks so much for the presentation. My question has to do with the different intervention types by site. I was curious if any of the interventions included training for officers. So I'm thinking about a lot of research that has been done on increased trainings with officers on community engagement, potentially impacting their policing in some of the areas that were proposed. So I was curious if you could just talk a little bit more about whether the field experiments included any capacity building for officers.
Thanks for raising that. We've just been going back to collect the materials that were used for the training from the 6 settings. And what we found is that there's a range. So in several of the settings, in Pakistan, for example, there was an extensive training program that was developed by the research team with the police agency on how to hold community meetings, on how to, on the components of problem-oriented policing and how to take action on information that comes through, and on other aspects of community policing. And that was true, I think, in 4 of the settings. And then in Brazil, we were working to expand an existing community policing program. Our sense from its training, our sense from its materials is there's relatively limited training, and so that's a dimension that we're gonna try to give a sense of the range of, because it seems like that that should play that'll play an important role.
Great, thanks, Amanda. So I've got Tori with her hand raised, and then I had seen others come up, but right now there aren't others showing. So if you do have a question, just try and get that up. If you're having trouble with it, feel free to type into the chat. Tori, go ahead.
Great, thanks. This is just such an incredible initiative, and to do this across so many countries, and yeah, it's really exciting. So congratulations to everyone involved. I'm curious, I find the null results really interesting, as I'm sure many people do. And I'm just wondering about things like how much people were informed about the changes in policy. I wonder how much of it is that I have this sort of one officer who's in my neighborhood all the time, and how much is knowing that it's been personalized for me. So just wondering if there's any variation in sort of the public education efforts, or maybe part of community policing is that the community initiates it and the community kind of consults, and it's not just that the police are changing their protocol, but that the people are actively involved. So I'm sure people have given a lot of thought to that, but I'm curious if you have any other insights on that you can share.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting issue, because there are a bunch of people that are direct participants in aspects of the intervention. So there is a set of citizens that come to community meetings and that have direct experiences interacting with beat cops on patrol. And then there's a set of the majority of the community which don't have those direct experiences. And so in order for there to be effects on the broader community, which is what we were targeting with our outcome measurement, which was not looking at people who we ex ante knew were participants in one of those interventions, you have to believe that there is a community response and broader community discussion of what's going on. I think that in some cases it would have been obvious that the intervention was going on in small villages in Uganda when the police are coming through in a more frequent way than they were before, or holding community meetings. It's probably a lot of people are finding out about it. The reason that we did it this way is that we see this as kind of part of the theory of change of community policing, is that there have to be these broader effects in the community. Otherwise, these relatively small community meetings and foot patrols are just unlikely to have important effects if they're only operating through the individuals. But I think a question for future research is what are the effects on the direct participants in these, and is it the case that there were big effects on those people that maybe would later translate into effects in the broader community? We are doing a long-term follow-up or longer-term follow-up in Pakistan to try to see whether there are kind of longer-term knock-on effects. Thanks.
That's a great suggestion. Mike, got you up next on the list.
Thanks, Graham. Huge congrats to you guys. A really terrific project, great presentation. A question on the trust, measuring trust here. In a bunch of interviews in the last couple of years, I sort of, have noticed that when we've sort of asked a lot about like trust at the local level, in a lot of these interviews, people are distinguishing between trust in like the individual kind of like local leaders or players, right? And, trust in individuals versus like trust in structure, right? And sort of, indicating that oftentimes there seem to be moving in response to interventions when it comes to just like the trust in individuals, right? But the structure seems to be incredibly hard to move, like trust on structure for, lots and lots of reasons, right? And so I wonder if, I'm curious in this case, whether you guys tried to, tease this out a little bit, whether some of the interventions could actually, move these individuals to see whatever individual police officers. And I know you had high rotation and whatnot, but like, do you see like any sort of, permanency or intermediate permanency, whatever it is, right? And then do you see like increased trust in like those individuals, even though like, the structure just seems, nearly impossible to change?
Thanks for that suggestion. I hadn't thought about that before. We are measuring trust in the structure, and so it's the questions are like, do you generally trust the police? Do you generally think that the police are providing an effective service? I'll have to go back through the questionnaires. I don't remember any questions about particular officers. I think in part because we were worried that that there wouldn't be particular officers that people had in mind, so they might not be able to answer it. But I'll go back through our questionnaires. It's possible that we measured something like that in a couple of the settings. It seems like a great thing to look at. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Isla.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Sorry, no video. We're struggling with the infrastructure here with our heat wave in Oakland, so apologize for that. I wanted to ask 3 quick questions, and I'm happy for you to address or not address any of those as you see fit. But I guess this project is super interesting to me, and I had a couple of questions. So the first is thinking about the variation that you showed in terms of these different countries, like Colombia and Brazil come out on the top in terms of level of democracy, for example, and openness. But like, does that translate into the police? Thinking about like Brazil being plagued by a lot of crime and Colombia having recent civil conflict, like, do we have something that's representative of like democratic but low development or medium development state in this bunch? Or could there be something about a selection effect or like a scope condition for this study that these are all places where the police really see themselves as being pretty weak and so wanting to improve? So I guess that's like a scope condition question about the study overall, because the results are super intriguing. Second question is about the ethical dimensions of this. I wonder if you guys thought a lot about the ethics and sort of how you made the decision. And there, especially, I'm thinking about Uganda in the way that you've described the case. I don't know the case super well, but to potentially be increasing the capacity and potentially the contact between local communities and police who might not be, super acting in the interests of the community. And then the third question, I guess, is a question that one of my students asked me the other day about tip lines in general and whether or not you saw any disinformation through tip lines. And that's just a completely random question, but struck me that you guys may actually have some data about whether tips are actually on average useful or whether there's disinformation there. So happy for you to answer any of these or not, but just wanted to raise these, and thanks so much for the project.
Thanks so much, Isla. I'll touch on all three of them briefly. The first question, I think that's something that I think that we need to do a better job of kind of characterizing the capacity of the police. We have these kind of imperfect measures of the number of officers, the citizens per station, and budgets. But I think it is the case that the Medellin police have gone through a series of pretty extensive police reforms and capacity building efforts over the last 20 years. And so I think actually for the Colombia site, our concern here might be that we are actually in the opposite direction, that we're at a ceiling, and that we couldn't have, that these marginal additional improvements to the capacity of the police and their information collection mechanism maybe too small of a change compared to the capacity that's been built in the past. So I think that I think it is the case that we are limited to a set of cases that have an experience with civil conflict and kind of long, difficult histories between citizens and the police. And so there may be settings that don't have those, where this would work differently. But I don't think that, I think that the dimension of the capacity of the police is one that we have quite a bit of variation on between Liberia and then Brazil and Colombia, which seem to have quite a bit of capacity to, but the Brazilian police that we worked with were implementing body-worn cameras and were really engaged in that effort. In terms of the ethics, we thought a lot about this, especially in two contexts. One is the one that you mentioned in Uganda, and one is in the Philippines, where there are concerns about the use of extrajudicial violence of the police in other parts of the Philippines. And so we set up both a vetting of the units and the areas that we were going to work in all 6 settings, but especially those 2. And a set of kind of warning mechanisms that would identify red lines after which we would kind of pull out of the project and end them. And so one of the reasons that we set up hotlines and marketed them in those places is so that we would have access to information about when there were incidents of police abuse that we might think were a problem. I think there are 2 reasons why we thought in Uganda in particular it was appropriate to continue to work with the police. One is that even though the police have this role of kind of solidifying the hold of Museveni, they have this dual role of preventing crime. And there's actually a lot of what the team found in their kind of inception activities was that there's actually a lot of demand of rural Ugandans for increased police presence. They want the police to be around more to prevent crime. And we do find some evidence of increased sort of requests for payments. So some kind of financial abuse. But in none of these settings did we detect any kind of physical abuse that we thought was caused by the intervention. And I think the other piece of it is just that these are a set of reforms that are being tried in a wide variety of places, including in authoritarian settings. And so under strict controls, it still seemed quite important to us to understand whether it is a tool that is going to backfire. And so we were in a position to measure backfire effects on trust and also on police abuse that would provide important evidence for preventing this from being rolled out in places where there might be those kind of negative effects. And thanks for the comment on disinformation. Salman Musa asked a couple days ago whether tips were just used, whether we were just encouraging people to kind of inform on their enemies to these hotlines. And I'm not sure, but we're going to go back and look and see what we can find from the data.
Great, thanks. I've got Morgan next.
Great, thanks a lot, Graham, for sharing this with us. I know you've had to present a lot, so appreciate it. So I have a sort of more of a policy question that is more important than I have a couple sort of methods questions that are just for my own curiosity, so you don't have to answer them if we don't have time. The more important like policy question, I really appreciated the last few slides that went through, oh gosh, why didn't this work? Because I have to say, I think, sorry about the background noise, my kids' school finished early today, so there's chaos. So in aid, probably a lot of people like these kinds of solutions that seem like they can quickly or without a lot of extra resources or massive structural change have an effect. So I think this would be probably good to share with our conflict stabilization prevention bureau. I might go upstairs if the noise in the background is distracting. To sort of debunk what some people might want to do as an easy solution. But I wondered if, anything more you can say on fleshing out some of those larger structural changes that might be needed. I saw in one of your slides, there was data collection amongst the police. Did the police who worked on these have anything to say about the rotation or the lack of resources or anything else that might be driving the lack of effects? Did they think it was effective? That sort of thing. Like, what did the police think? Did they like, yeah, this we knew it wasn't effective. It's because I don't have what I need to do my job. Or do we have any sense from them? And then the two quick methods questions, just my curiosity. I've tried to do crime prevalence, violence prevalence surveys in various Latin American countries, and it's really expensive. It ended up almost being too expensive for us to do, even as a pretty large government agency. So I wondered how you guys pulled off all of the prevalence surveys, and like, indeed, if you have confidence in them, because that is hard to get at without a large budget. And then the other one is for Brazil, I think I noticed on one of the slides that it only had one of the many components of communities policing. And did you think that the sort of low dosage intervention is what might be causing some of the low effects there?
Thanks, Morgan. Would love to present this at AID. In terms of your question about the structural changes, these ideas mostly came about ex post in trying to further unpack why this didn't happen. So, we had kind of written down our expectations about like how we would interpret null effects if we found them, and I think a number of those mechanisms didn't turn out to be true. And so these three that we've come up with: the officer rotation, the lack of resources to take action, and the kind of lack of prioritization are mostly kind of ex post stories that came from talking with our police partners at the center, but also to a certain extent with individuals. And so unfortunately, it means that we don't have a huge number of questions on the officer survey about rotation and that kind of thing. We do have a couple of questions about kind of what they thought was whether they thought it was effective and why. And I haven't analyzed them yet, so I don't know. But I think that's a great. We'll try to bring some of that flavor in. So I guess that's what I have to say about that. In terms of the crime prevalence, this was like one of the central things that we were focusing on. So I think probably we just spent an amount of money that you would think is like a wild amount of money. I guess what you mean is like you have to ask a ton of questions, and you have to interview a ton of people because some of the crimes are kind of rare.
Exactly, sample size because of the rareness.
So I think our ex post power analysis suggests that we had enough power in these areas, but we were worried going into it about whether that was the case. And I think I think we did giant surveys. So I think that's we spent the amount of money that you're thinking of. In terms of the multiple components, I do think that is potentially part of it. We saw the way community policing is being expanded around the world, and the way that it's being expanded is that even in agencies that have histories of some aspects of community policing, they're increasing on some set of dimensions the intensity of foot patrols and the frequency of meetings and the geographic scope of the meetings. And so I think like we should just think of this as a test of increasing the intensity of community policing practices. And we did that. That meant different things in different places, as it would mean in other police agencies. And so I don't think it's a pure test of all of these community policing aspects together, because that's not something that is happening in almost any places except in Liberia, where there really isn't a history in Monrovia of these community policing practices. But I think that both in Colombia and Brazil, I think that's a reasonable interpretation of the effects.
Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. So we're at about noon, so we've been going for an hour. I don't see any other hands raised at the moment. We do have, some more time if people are interested. That would, yeah, great. So we've got Lucia up next.
Hi. Hi, Graham. Hi, all. I just had, I feel a little bit bad because we've communicated over email, and I'm gonna throw a question that I asked you over the email. I don't know if that's fair, but my questions are about kind of like the community side of this. So we tend to think about, community policing. We put a lot of emphasis on what happens in the police and kind of like change police practices to bring them closer to the community. But my questions are about what happens on the other side. So like in either in the ethnography or in the survey, do you have ways of figuring out like what happened if there were community policing forums, for example, that took place? How did that happen? So I know, for example, so Yanila Gonzalez wrote her dissertation about different types of community policing in different parts of Latin America. And I think that some of the things that she finds are related to the way that the police conduct those meetings. And so in some cases, they're very top down. It's just like, so this is what's going to happen. This is what we're going to do. And the community or people that attend are more like, passive listeners and don't really have an opportunity to voice concerns. I know from my own research that in South Africa, for example, the community policing forums generate weird expectations in terms of, participants thinking, for example, that they should be paid to attend. And so, maybe that changes the dynamics in this sort of trust building exercise. And then my other question is like, well, sort of, are there homogeneous expectations from people on what the police should be doing? So does trust mean the same thing for everyone? Does effectiveness mean the same thing for everyone? Or is it the case that, if I have a more authoritarian view of what the role of the police should be, then I'm gonna feel weird about this, like, oh, let's bring everyone together in a forum to talk about what our role, what the role of the police is, and I just want enforcement, period. I was wondering if you were able to, if that matters at all, if you think it matters, if you were able to tease out any of these differences. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lucia, and thanks for your detailed written comments. Really appreciated them. First, in terms of the types of community policing, what happened in these meetings, I think, was somewhat different in the 6 different contexts, and I think there are kind of both of what you're talking about. I think in a couple of them they really were quite top down, and there was a bunch of information shared from the police about how to report on crimes and the police's view on what the problems were in the community, and somewhat less of a discussion. That wasn't the case in at least 3 of them, we're kind of currently compiling the meeting agendas and the transcripts of them to try to have to try to be able to say something a little bit clearer about what was happening. But they in Colombia, for example, the meetings were pretty highly structured, so that there was a long period where citizens were able to speak, and so the commander would introduce the agenda, but the meeting was kind of run by citizens and not by the police. And that's also true in Pakistan, that they were, men and women were separated in these 2 interventions, and the organization was really highly structured, so that the police were speaking for a kind of limited period of time to transmit information about criminal justice procedures, which was an important aspect of it, and then to kind of open up for community discussion. But I think it's something that we should. I think what we should do is code the types of agendas and the plans that they had along these dimensions. And I'll go back to Janildo's paper, who is in my cohort in grad school. So thanks for that reminder.
Great, thank you, Lucia. Mike?
Yeah, a couple more quick questions. I was curious about when you're talking about kind of like you have case examples or whatnot, you're pitching that like at a country level, and I'm curious to have you like comment more on like whether it makes sense to do it at the country level like this, or whether it would make more sense to do it like at a subnational level. I mean, so I think about doing it at a country level. It seems like there are a bunch of, I think I could imagine a bunch of conditions under which it would be appropriate to do it, but those tend to be, I think maybe there's like a representative sample somehow, or sufficient coverage, or maybe like what the national police has is done everywhere, right? So that when you choose a case like Medellin, right, like for Colombia, right, like we could expect that similar things are happening in Cali or Barranquilla or wherever else, right? And so but it seems like maybe there's probably a lot of like subnational variation, I guess. And so I'm curious, and maybe I just missed it, but I didn't know if like within, say, like Medellin or wherever else, that you are like randomly sampling like the neighborhoods or things like that. I know the units sort of varied a little bit here, so but I'd be curious to have you comment just a bit more on kind of like what that process ought to look like. I guess Uganda was nationwide, and so maybe in some context, and this seems to stand a little bit in contrast to Mediketa 1, where they tended to be larger coverage, some nation, not maybe some nationwide, some at least regionally, but and then one other question, just and maybe I missed this, but you kind of talked about like ethnographic, sort of inquiry about why things didn't work. You did mention there were a few significant results, I think, in like Pakistan, Liberia, Colombia. I'm curious if like you sort of like went after that ethnographically to see whether that was just random chance, or whether there was something specific about those particular areas and those particular effects that that might be worth sort of chasing in the future.
Thanks. These are really helpful. I think that we definitely think that there are subnational conditions that make it maybe more and less effective. We don't have a lot of purchase on that because we only worked except in Brazil, where we were working in a bunch of different municipalities within Santa Catarina, and in Uganda, where we were working in a bunch of different areas. I think, unfortunately, in Uganda, well, in both cases, we don't see heterogeneity by location type, and so I guess that's one empirical piece of it. But I think, yeah, I think we were presenting these kind of country level features to give a flavor of what kinds of places these are for people who are less familiar with them, but definitely think that we should be thinking about subnational characteristics, and our data collection around the capacity of the police and the officer rotation rate and other things are at the level that we were working at. But I think it's an open question, like whether in different cities in Colombia this would really be different. My suspicion is it really would be quite different given our investigations. And then in terms of the positive effects, we don't have a clear sense of why there are these different effects. I think each of the teams has an ex post suspicion about why there are these positive effects. So in Pakistan, their suspicion about these attitudinal effects is that this was actually quite effective at changing minds in the short term, and that if there's continued follow through from the intervention, then they expect to see in their follow up survey in next year effects on security outcomes. And so I guess we'll see whether they're right about that. In Colombia, where they see changes in police capacity, perceived police capacity, I think that they think that that there was a demonstration effect in these community meetings that changed people's priors about what the police were able to do. And so I'm not especially sure what to make of it, given that we didn't. Not only do we not find consistent effects within any case in the multiple dimensions of perceptions of the police from citizens, but we don't, like, the effects that we find in some contexts don't replicate on those dimensions in other contexts. So at a minimum, it's a kind of a mixed bag of maybe the specifics of the intervention and what they focused on in the community meetings. I think it's at the moment kind of somewhat hard to parse, but welcome other thoughts about it.
Great, thanks so much. So I think that covers all the questions that people had posted. So I'm sure, Graham, you'd be open to follow up if people are interested in doing that offline. I think that, I mean, an important thing that I took away here is making me think more, and this is also came up during the discussion, about how, like mistrust and perceptions, may or may not correspond to like material crime conditions, and how the actions, that police take or reforms that are undertaken in these ways, like what is the sort of perceptual context, to what extent has there been mobilization to raise the salience of issues, even if material conditions haven't changed necessarily, and how does that then moderate the potential for an intervention like this to actually, change the way people think. I think, there's interesting questions that come up about the perceptual context that we may not be able to track just looking at material conditions, but, probing and getting a sense of what the situation is, the degree of mobilization that was there, and the extent to which, the intervention that's coming in is meeting a demand, or something that's being brought in a way that people aren't, sort of expecting or necessarily demanding at the time. And so, aren't ready to kind of like pick up on, what it's signaling on the part of the intentions of the police, and I'm wondering if there's a way to kind of look at the context and also look at the data from the other studies that have been done previously to see, whether it matters the extent to which there had been this like prior mobilization and expressed demand to which the reforms were responding, or whether these were interventions that were mostly supply side initiatives that weren't like, happening at a time of like salience and high, high expressed demand. To me, I think that's an issue that I think would be interesting to look into. But anyway, thanks so much for the presentation. Thanks everybody for coming up. Be on the lookout if you haven't seen it yet for the other dissemination events that we have planned, and hope to see you online again.